He did not begin as a monster in uniform. He began as a lawyer. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born in October 1903 in a quiet region of northern Austria, far from Berlin and far from the centers of power that would later define his life. He was tall even in youth, physically imposing, with sharp features and a presence that commanded attention. After completing his early education, he studied law at the University of Graz, graduating in the late 1920s. On paper, his future pointed toward a respectable legal career within Austria's professional class. But the political climate of post-war Europe pulled him in another direction. Austria in the early 1930s was unstable, divided, and increasingly radicalized. Nationalist movements flourished underground, especially those aligned with German National Socialism, which was officially banned by the Austrian government. Joining such movements carried serious personal risk. Arrest, imprisonment, and professional ruin were real possibilities. Kaltenbrunner accepted those risks willingly. He joined the Austrian Nazi movement while it was still illegal, and soon afterward entered the SS, becoming part of a small but highly committed cadre operating in secrecy. What distinguished him early was not charisma or ideological originality, but discipline. He followed orders precisely. He organized cells, enforced loyalty, and accepted personal danger without hesitation. Austrian authorities arrested him multiple times during the early 1930s for illegal political activity. In 1934, after a failed Nazi coup attempt in Vienna, he was detained again and sentenced to prison. Instead of breaking him, imprisonment hardened his resolve. He emerged more radical, more committed, and more valuable to the underground network. When Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in March 1938, everything changed overnight. Men who had been criminals suddenly became officials. Kaltenbrunner transitioned seamlessly from underground operative to state authority. He was appointed to senior security positions in Vienna, overseeing police coordination, intelligence gathering, and political repression. His legal background gave him an advantage. He understood how to close violence and coercion in administrative language. By the outbreak of war, his responsibilities had expanded significantly. He rose through SS ranks with steady reliability, earning a reputation as a strict administrator who demanded obedience and efficiency. Unlike flamboyant figures who sought attention, Kaltenbrunner worked quietly within bureaucratic structures. That made him dangerous. Files from this period describe him as ideologically loyal, organizationally ruthless, and personally ambitious. His network within the Austrian SS strengthened his position inside the larger German system. He was not an outsider begging for acceptance. He was a proven asset. When Berlin looked for men who could be trusted to enforce security without hesitation, Kaltenbrunner's name surfaced repeatedly. His rise was gradual but deliberate. By the early 1940s, he was no longer just an Austrian official. He was part of the Reich's inner security apparatus, positioned for a far greater role when opportunity arrived. That opportunity came with violence. The death of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942 created a vacuum at the very top of the Nazi security system. Heydrich had been the architect of a vast, centralized organization that merged intelligence, political policing, and domestic surveillance into a single structure, the Reich Main Security Office, known as the RSHA. His assassination left the regime without its most efficient enforcer, and replacing him was not a simple decision. For months, leadership hesitated. The RSHA was too powerful to entrust to just anyone. Finally, in early 1943, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was summoned to Berlin. On January 30th, he formally assumed leadership of the RSHA. The appointment placed him at the head of an enormous apparatus, controlling the Gestapo, criminal police, and domestic and foreign intelligence services. It was one of the most powerful positions in the Third Reich. Kaltenbrunner did not restructure the system. He did not need to. His task was to keep it functioning as Germany's military situation deteriorated. He oversaw coordination between departments, signed directives, and ensured that orders moved quickly from the top down.
Kaltenbrunner claimed his role was administrative. Surviving documents show his signature on policies related to arrests, deportations, and intelligence operations. His relationship with Heinrich Himmler was central to his power. Himmler valued loyalty and order above all else. Kaltenbrunner provided both. Over time, Himmler delegated increasing responsibility to him, especially as the war demanded Himmler's attention elsewhere. Internal correspondence suggests that Kaltenbrunner often acted with broad autonomy, particularly in matters of internal security. Within the RSHA, Power dynamics were complex. Senior officials controlled specific departments, but Kaltenbrunner sat above them all. He chaired meetings, approved initiatives, and mediated conflicts. In some cases, he bypassed intermediaries entirely, communicating directly with Hitler during the final months of the war. This access made him feared even by other senior officials. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, Kaltenbrunner's authority expanded further. The regime unleashed a wave of investigations, arrests, and executions. The RSHA coordinated much of this response. Under Kaltenbrunner's leadership, the machinery moved quickly and without restraint. He did not personally interrogate prisoners, but he oversaw the system that did. As Germany's position worsened, internal security became a matter of survival for the regime. Fear replaced confidence. Kaltenbrunner's role shifted from maintaining order to preventing collapse. He issued directives on evacuations, suppression of dissent, and intelligence gathering, even as Allied forces closed in from all sides. By late 1944, he was one of the most powerful men in Berlin, presiding over a crumbling state held together by repression. By early 1944, Ernst Kaltenbrunner had become one of the most powerful men inside the collapsing structure of the Third Reich. Officially, he was still subordinate to Heinrich Himmler, but in practice, the lines of authority had blurred. Himmler was increasingly distracted, obsessed with maintaining favor with Hitler while secretly exploring possible negotiations with the Western Allies. As Himmler drifted between
fantasy and fear, Kaltenbrunner tightened his grip on the internal security apparatus. Within the Reich Security Main Office, decisions no longer required lengthy debates. Orders moved quickly, stamped with Kaltenbrunner's approval, transmitted down a chain of command that understood hesitation could be fatal. Surveillance expanded. Arrests accelerated. Investigations into dissent, real or imagined, multiplied as paranoia consumed the regime from within. The failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944 only intensified this climate. After the bomb plot collapsed, Kaltenbrunner played a central role in coordinating the regime's response. The RSHA became the nerve center of repression. Thousands were arrested in sweeping purges that extended far beyond the actual conspirators. Military officers, civil servants, clergy, and private citizens were pulled into interrogations that often ended in execution. Kaltenbrunner did not need to personally sign every order. His authority was systemic. The machine operated because he ensured it did. At the same time, rivalries inside the security services grew sharper. Heinrich Himmler, the long-serving head of the Gestapo, retained deep operational control and unmatched institutional knowledge. Some historians argue Himmler acted independently, shielded by his indispensability. Others believe Kaltenbrunner gradually asserted dominance, not by direct confrontation, but by positioning himself as the indispensable coordinator between Hitler, Himmler, and the security branches. Foreign intelligence, too, fell increasingly under Kaltenbrunner's scrutiny. As Germany's military situation worsened, the regime sought leverage through espionage and back-channel diplomacy. Walter Schellenberg's intelligence operations became entangled with political maneuvering, and Kaltenbrunner monitored these efforts closely. Documents suggest he reviewed major initiatives and intervened when outcomes threatened internal stability. By late 1944, Berlin itself was no longer a secure capital. Bombing raids intensified, ministries evacuated or operated from ruins. Yet the RSHA continued to function, issuing directives even as communications faltered and
authority fragmented. Kaltenbrunner moved between offices and temporary headquarters, maintaining control through personal presence and fear. Power, at this stage, was not about territory. It was about information, loyalty, and survival. As the Third Reich collapsed in early 1945, Ernst Kaltenbrunner shifted from administrator to fugitive without ever formally relinquishing authority. Even as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, he continued to issue security instructions, approve intelligence movements, and communicate with remaining RSHA units. The state was dying, but the machinery of repression refused to shut down. Kaltenbrunner traveled frequently during these final months, moving between Berlin, southern Germany, and Austria. His movements reflected both strategic calculation and desperation. Like many senior officials, he was drawn to the idea of an Alpine redoubt, a mythical last fortress where the regime might regroup. Though militarily unrealistic, the concept shaped decisions and provided psychological refuge for men unwilling to accept defeat. In April 1945, Kaltenbrunner settled near Alta See in the Austrian Alps. There, surrounded by loyal SS personnel and medical staff, he attempted to remain relevant. Messages continued to flow outward, even as meaningful command structures disintegrated. Some accounts suggest he hoped to position himself as a negotiator, a man who could speak to the Allies from a position of authority. Whether this was genuine belief or self-delusion remains debated. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Kaltenbrunner did not. He remained hidden for several days, disguised and moving between mountain lodges. When American forces finally located him on May 12, he attempted to conceal his identity, claiming to be a doctor under an assumed name. The ruse failed quickly. Witnesses identified him, and his arrest ended one of the last major manhunts for a senior SS leader. Transferred to Allied custody, Kaltenbrunner was eventually brought to Nuremberg. Physically imposing even after months of illness and exhaustion, he stood out among the defendants. At over 6 feet tall, scarred and visibly hardened, he presented himself as a bureaucrat.
Rather than a criminal mastermind, his defense strategy was consistent and calculated. Deny operational responsibility, deflect blame upward to Himmler and downward to subordinates. But the documents told a different story. RSHA files bore his signature. Orders carried his initials. Witnesses described meetings where policies of repression were discussed and approved. Former colleagues testified to his authority. The prosecution dismantled his claims piece by piece, revealing the extent of his administrative power and his knowledge of crimes committed under his leadership. In October 1946, the tribunal reached its verdict. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sentenced to death, he was executed shortly thereafter. His rise, from an Austrian lawyer to the head of the Reich's security empire, ended not in exile or negotiation, but in judgment. The system he helped sustain collapsed around him, leaving behind a legacy defined not by loyalty or discipline, but by responsibility for one of history's darkest chapters. Before we wrap up this story, I want to step back from the documents, ranks, and dates and speak honestly about what this history means and why figures like Ernst Kaltenbrunner still matter today. Kaltenbrunner is often described as a bureaucrat, a man who hid behind files, signatures, and organizational charts. And that description is partly true. He was not the architect of Nazi ideology, nor was he the charismatic face of the regime. But that is exactly what makes his story so disturbing. He represents the kind of power that does not shout, does not make speeches from balconies, but quietly ensures that terror works efficiently. Systems like the RSHA did not function because of one madman at the top. They functioned because educated, disciplined, ambitious men chose career advancement over humanity. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner tried to present himself as a legal professional trapped inside an enormous machine he could not control. But history shows that machines like this do not run on their own. Orders are written by people. Meetings are attended by people. Silence is chosen by people. Even when responsibility
is shared, guilt does not disappear. Kaltenbrunner may not have personally carried out crimes, but he helped coordinate, authorize, and protect the system that made them possible. Without men like him, the machinery of repression would have stalled. What also stands out is how late he remained loyal. Even as the Reich collapsed, even as Berlin burned and the fronts disintegrated, Kaltenbrunner continued issuing security orders, chasing enemies, and protecting the internal structure of power. That persistence tells us something important. Ideology aside, this was also about control. Power had become his identity. Losing it meant losing everything. There is another uncomfortable lesson here. Kaltenbrunner was not uneducated. He was not chaotic or irrational. He was trained, methodical, and intelligent. History often reassures us by portraying evil as madness, because madness feels distant and rare. But Kaltenbrunner reminds us that evil can be organized, calm, and professional. It can wear a suit, quote regulations, and insist it is simply doing its job. At Nuremberg, the world tried to draw a line. The trials were not just about punishment, they were about record, responsibility, and memory. Kaltenbrunner's conviction was not only for what he personally ordered, but for what he knowingly sustained. That distinction matters. It tells future generations that hiding behind hierarchy is not a defense. Authority does not erase accountability. When we study figures like Kaltenbrunner, we are not doing it to sensationalize the past. We do it to understand how modern states, institutions, and security systems can be corrupted when loyalty replaces conscience. The danger is not only dictators. The danger is the quiet normalization of cruelty inside organizations that reward obedience and punish dissent. History does not repeat itself in exact form, but it echoes, and those echoes become louder when people stop asking hard questions about power, responsibility, and moral choice. That's why stories like this are worth telling. If you found this analysis meaningful, or if it made you think differently about how history actually works behind the scenes, please support.
Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.